You were taught that entropy means disorder. You learnt it in school, probably in a chemistry class, probably next to a diagram of a messy room or a shuffled deck of cards. The teacher said something like, "The universe tends toward disorder. Entropy always increases." And you nodded because it sounded reasonable. Things fall apart. Rooms get messy. Ice melts. That is entropy. That is not entropy. That has never been entropy. And the fact that you were taught that definition, that it still appears in textbooks published this year, that entire generations of students have graduated with this equation in their heads, connected to the wrong idea, should genuinely disturb you. Because what entropy actually measures is something so much deeper and so much darker than messiness, that the moment you understand the real version, it changes how you think about time, about aging, about death, and about the final fate of everything that exists. There is a grave in Vienna. It sits in the Zentralfriedhof, the city's central cemetery, under a marble bust of a heavy-set man with wild hair and spectacles. And carved into the stone above that bust is an equation, 5 symbols, S equals K log W. That equation is not a footnote in the history of physics. It is arguably the most consequential formula ever written, and the man buried beneath it killed himself before the world accepted he was right. I spent an unreasonable amount of time reading about this, and I still do not fully know how to sit with what I found, because that equation does not describe disorder. It describes a direction the universe is being forced to move in, a direction that explains why time only flows one way, why your body breaks down, why every star will eventually go dark. And the man who discovered it was destroyed, not by the equation, but by the refusal of his own colleagues to believe what it meant. But before we get to him, and before we get to what happened in a hotel room on the Adriatic coast in September of 1906, you need to see why the thing you were taught is not just incomplete, but actively wrong. Take a glass of water and freeze it. You get ice, a crystal lattice, every molecule locked into a rigid, repeating structure. It looks ordered. It looks neat. Now melt it. You get liquid water, molecules tumbling over each other, rotating, translating, vibrating. In every direction, it looks disordered. It looks messy. If entropy means disorder, the liquid should have lower entropy and the solid should have higher entropy. The messy one should be the high entropy state. But that is exactly backwards. The entropy of liquid water at 25 degrees Celsius is 69.91 joules per Kelvin per mole. The entropy of ice at the same reference temperature is 37.99. The liquid has nearly double the entropy of the crystal. The ordered crystal is the low entropy state. The disordered liquid is the high entropy state. The disorder framing gets the most basic example wrong. And it gets worse. Take a bottle of Italian salad dressing. Shake it up. Oil and vinegar mixed together. It looks disordered, chaotic, blended. Set it down and wait. The oil rises, the vinegar sinks, and you get 2 clean, separated layers. It looks ordered, neat, organized, but the separated state, the one that looks tidy, is the maximum entropy configuration. The system reached equilibrium by separating, not by mixing. If entropy were disorder, equilibrium would look like a mess. It does not. It looks like 2 clean layers sitting quietly on your countertop. Or take a deck of cards, shuffle it. You go from suits arranged in order to some random permutation. Every popular science explanation you have ever seen calls this an entropy increase. It is not. The thermodynamic entropy of the deck, the actual physical quantity measured in joules per Kelvin, does not change by a single unit when you shuffle the cards. The molecules in the cardboard are vibrating at the same frequencies. The temperature is the same. The energy distribution is the same. You rearrange the labels on the cards. You did not change the physics of the cards. The entropy is identical before and after. Frank Lambert, a professor emeritus at Occidental College, published a paper in the Journal of Chemical Education in 2002 called Disorder, a cracked crutch for supporting entropy discussions. He gave example after example of the disorder analogy leading students to the wrong answer. He spent the last 2 decades of his career contacting textbook publishers, and by the time of his death in 2018, at the age of 100, he had influenced at least 36 science textbooks to remove the word disorder from their entropy discussions. 36 out of hundreds. The lie is still being taught right now, today, in classrooms around the world. And the origin of the lie can be traced to a single man and a single paper. Daniel Steyer of Oberlin College published the most comprehensive historical forensics in his 2019 paper, Entropy as Disorder. History of a Misconception, in The Physics Teacher, Volume 57, pages 454 through 458. Steyer traced the first explicit equation of entropy with disorder to Hermann von Helmholtz. On February 2, 1882, Helmholtz presented a paper to the Berlin Academy of Sciences called Die Thermodynamik chemischer Vorgänge, the thermodynamics of chemical processes. In that paper, he wrote that one may, in a certain sense, characterize the magnitude of the entropy as the measure of the disorder. In a certain sense, he qualified it. He applied it only to the specific case of ideal gases without external forces, a context where the analogy happens to work by coincidence. When the passage was translated from German, that qualification was lost. The nuance evaporated, and what remained was entropy equals disorder, taught to every chemistry student on the planet for the next 140 years. The idea entered popular culture through Henry Adams, the American historian, whose posthumous autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1919. Adams wrote, "The kinetic theory of gas is an assertion of ultimate chaos. In plain words, chaos was the law of nature and order was the dream of man." Gilbert Lewis, the great American chemist, introduced the shuffled deck of cards analogy in his 1925 book, The Anatomy of Science, and the image stuck. Google Ngram data shows the entropy disorder association surging between 1915 and 1930 and never declining. The first published critique was by Satyendra Ray in 1934. That means physicists have known the analogy was wrong for over 90 years. Bohren and Albrecht, in their 1998 Oxford University Press textbook on atmospheric thermodynamics, called The Entropy Disorder Connection, a persistent swindle. A swindle in an Oxford University Press textbook. And yet, when you search entropy definition, right now, today, the first result will almost certainly say disorder. The swindle persists because it is convenient, because it is easy to teach, because the real definition requires you to think about microstates and macrostates and logarithms and probability, and the disorder definition requires you to think about a messy bedroom. We chose the easy version. And the easy version hid from us the fact that entropy is not a property of messiness. It is a property of reality itself. It is the deepest structural constraint on what can happen, what will happen, and what direction everything is heading. So if entropy is not disorder, what is it? This is where the equation on the tombstone comes in. S equals K log W. S is entropy. K is a constant, a tiny number, 1.380649 times 10 to the negative 23 joules per Kelvin. It is the bridge between the microscopic world and the macroscopic world, and it was named after the man buried under the stone, Ludwig Boltzmann. Log is the natural logarithm, and W, the most important letter, stands for the German word Wahrscheinlichkeit, probability. Specifically, W is the number of microstates consistent with a given macrostate. I need you to understand what that means because it is the key to everything that follows. A macrostate is what you can measure with a thermometer and a pressure gauge. Temperature, pressure, volume. A microstate is the exact position and momentum of every single particle in the system. For a liter of gas at room temperature, there are roughly 10 to the power of something in the billions of microstates that all produce the same macrostate. That number is so large that writing it out would take more digits than there are atoms in the observable universe. Entropy measures how many of these hidden arrangements are lurking beneath the surface of what you observe. The higher the entropy, the more ways reality can be rearranged beneath your feet without you noticing a thing. It is not about messiness. It is about hiddenness. It is about the gap between what you see and what is actually going on. And the second law of thermodynamics, the law that says entropy always increases, means something profoundly different when you understand it this way. It does not mean things get messy. It means reality is constantly migrating toward the macrostates that have the most microstates hiding behind them. It is being pulled, statistically relentlessly, toward the configurations that can be arranged in the most possible ways without you noticing. Not because some force pushes it there, but because those states are so overwhelmingly more numerous that any other outcome is essentially impossible. Imagine throwing a handful of sand onto a table. You could, in principle, throw it so that every grain lands in a perfect circle. There is a microstate that corresponds to that. But the number of microstates corresponding to a random scatter is so astronomically larger that you would have to throw the sand more times than there are seconds in the age of the universe before the circle happened even once. That is what the second law is actually saying. Reality is not falling into disorder. It is being forced toward the most probable arrangement. And the most probable arrangement at every scale, for every system, in every corner of the universe, is the one where the energy is spread out as evenly as possible, and nothing interesting is happening anymore. That last part is the part they do not teach you in school, and it is the part that connects this equation to your life, your death, and the death of everything else. But I need to take you somewhere else first, because there is something even stranger buried inside this equation, and it took 150 years for anyone to fully reckon with it. Every law of physics you have ever heard of works the same way forward and backward in time. That sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete. Newton's second law, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. Acceleration is the second derivative of position with respect to time. If you replace t with negative t, the the second derivative does not change, because -1 squared is 1. Any trajectory that obeys Newton's law played forward also obeys it, played backward. Film a billiard ball rolling across a table, and the reversed film shows a physically valid trajectory. Nothing in Newton's equations tells you which version is real. Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism. Replace T with -T. Flip the direction of the magnetic field, which depends on the direction of current, which depends on the direction of velocity, which flips under time reversal, and the equations hold. A radio wave propagating forward in time is just as valid propagating backward. The Schrodinger equation in quantum mechanics. Eugene Wigner showed in 1932 that if you replace the wave function psi of t with the complex conjugate of psi of -t, the equation is satisfied. Quantum mechanics does not know which direction time runs. General relativity, Einstein's field equations. They are tensorial equations relating the curvature of spacetime to the distribution of energy and momentum. Replace t with -t, and the equations hold. A black hole played in reverse is a white hole, and the mathematics is perfectly self-consistent. Every single fundamental law of physics is time reversal invariant. Every one. There is no equation in the foundations of physics that contains an arrow pointing from past to future. Time at the level of fundamental law is symmetric, except for one, the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy was lower in the past. Entropy will be higher in the future. Film a glass shattering on a kitchen floor, and you can tell instantly whether the film runs forward or backward. The shattered glass reassembling itself and leaping back onto the counter is not a valid physical process. Not because it violates Newton's laws. Every individual shard flying backward would obey F equals ma perfectly. It is invalid because the probability of all those shards having exactly the right velocities to reconverge is so small that it would never happen in the lifetime of the universe. The second law is the only law of physics that distinguishes past from future. It is the only law that knows time has a direction. Every other equation is blind to it. Arthur Eddington, the British astrophysicist who confirmed general relativity during the solar eclipse of 1919, gave a series of lectures at the University of Edinburgh in January through March of 1927. They were published the following year as The Nature of the Physical World. In those lectures, Eddington coined the phrase that physicists still use today, time's arrow. He wrote, "Let us draw an arrow arbitrarily. If, as we follow the arrow, we find more and more of the random element in the state of the world, then the arrow is pointing towards the future. If the random element decreases, the arrow points towards the past. I shall use the phrase time's arrow to express this one-way property of time which has no analog in space." And then he wrote the passage that should be carved above the entrance to every physics department in the world. The law that entropy always increases, the second law of thermodynamics, holds, I think, the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. Eddington gave those lectures in 1927, and in the 99 years since, no one has found a reason to disagree with him. The second law has survived every theoretical revolution of the 20th century. It survived quantum mechanics, which overthrew classical determinism but left the second law intact. It survived general relativity, which bent space and time but could not bend entropy downward. It survived the discovery of antimatter, the invention of quantum field theory, the development of the Standard Model. Every new framework in physics has been required to be compatible with the second law, and every framework that was not compatible was rejected. There have been apparent challenges. In 2002, a group led by Gianmarco Wang at the Australian National University used optical tweezers to track the motion of latex microspheres in water and published their results in physical review letters. They observed, over time scales of a few tenths of a second, that the entropy of the small system occasionally decreased. The entropy fluctuated downward. This was not a violation of the second law, but a confirmation of the fluctuation theorem developed by Dennis Evans and Deborah Searles in the 1990s, which gives a precise mathematical expression for the ratio of entropy increasing to entropy decreasing trajectories in small systems over short times. The ratio is exponential in the entropy change and the time duration. For macroscopic systems over macroscopic times, the probability of a net entropy decrease is essentially zero. But for microscopic systems over brief moments, fluctuations can go either way. The second law is not violated by these observations. It is refined. It tells you not just that entropy increases, but exactly how unlikely a decrease is, and how that unlikelihood scales with the size and duration of the system. This refinement actually makes the second law more robust, not less. It extends its reach into regimes where the original classical formulation was silent. It connects the macroscopic arrow of time to specific, measurable, experimentally confirmed probability distributions at the microscopic level. And it confirms Boltzmann's core insight. The second law is statistical. Its reliability emerges from the staggering number of particles in any macroscopic system. The larger the system, the more reliable the law, and the universe is the largest system there is. Think about what Eddington is saying. He is saying that the second law outranks everything. It outranks electromagnetism. It outranks quantum mechanics. It outranks general relativity. And this is the law that every physics class, in every high school, in every country, teaches as things get messy. The supreme law of nature. And we handed it to students with a metaphor about bedroom tidiness. I want to make sure the full weight of this lands. Every other law of physics is a two-way street. You can run Newton's laws backward and the math works. You can run quantum mechanics backward and the math works. You can run general relativity backward and the math works. The second law is the only one-way street in all of physics. It is the only equation that looks different depending on which direction you run it. And that one-wayness is not a side effect or a curiosity or an interesting footnote. It is the reason you experience time at all. It is the reason you can remember the past but not the future. It is the reason causation flows from earlier to later and not the other way around. If you filmed every process in the universe at the molecular level and ran the film backward, Newton's laws would not complain. Maxwell's equations would not complain. The Schrodinger equation would not complain. Every fundamental equation would say, yes, this is a valid trajectory. The only thing that would tell you the film was running backward is entropy. Entropy would be decreasing in the reversed film, and that would mark it as the wrong direction. Entropy is the universe's only clock. It is the only physical quantity that distinguishes before from after. And here is the part that should unsettle you. If the arrow of time comes from entropy, and entropy increase is a statistical tendency rather than an absolute law, then the distinction between past and future is not absolute either. It is probabilistic. It is overwhelmingly reliable. So reliable that you can build your entire experience of reality on it and never notice the cracks. But at its foundation, the distinction between past and future is a matter of probability, not certainty. The universe does not have a rule that says time goes this way. It has a statistical tendency, and that tendency rests on an initial condition that nobody can explain. But here is where it gets worse. If the second law is the reason time has a direction, and if the second law is statistical, meaning it describes what is overwhelmingly probable rather than what is absolutely certain, then the arrow of time is not a fundamental feature of the universe. It is an accident. It depends entirely on the universe having started in a very specific, very improbable state, and nobody can explain why it did. This is called the past hypothesis. The philosopher David Albert gave it that name in his 2000 book, Time and Chance, published by Harvard University Press. Though the idea goes back to Boltzmann himself, the past hypothesis states that the universe began in an extraordinarily low entropy state near the Big Bang. Entropy has been increasing ever since, and that increase is the arrow of time. The past hypothesis is not derived from any deeper law. It is not predicted by general relativity, or quantum mechanics, or string theory, or any other framework. It is simply assumed. Physics takes it as a given and builds everything on top of it. Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020, calculated how improbable that initial state was. He published the calculation in his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, though the argument first appeared in his 1979 essay, Singularities and Time Asymmetry. He estimated the probability at 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. I need you to sit with that number for a moment, because it is the most extreme number in all of physics, and it is almost never discussed publicly. To write this number in decimal form, you would need 10 to the 123 zeros after the decimal point. The observable universe contains roughly 10 to the 80 particles. You could not write a zero on every proton and neutron in the universe and come close to writing this number down. You would run out of particles in the universe before you ran out of zeros. And physics has no explanation for why the initial state was this improbable. None. Sean Carroll, the theoretical physicist at Johns Hopkins, has argued that cosmic inflation, which is often invoked as a solution, actually makes the problem worse, because getting inflation to start requires even lower entropy initial conditions than the standard Big Bang model. The early universe was extraordinarily uniform. The cosmic microwave background shows temperature fluctuations of only about 1 part in 100,000. For gravitational systems, uniformity is the low entropy state, because gravity wants to clump matter into black holes, which are the maximum gravitational entropy configurations. The smooth, hot, dense, early universe was as far from gravitational equilibrium as it could possibly be. So the arrow of time, the reason you remember yesterday but not tomorrow, The reason eggs break but do not unbreak, the reason you age, depends on an initial condition so improbable that the number describing its improbability cannot be written using all the matter in the observable universe. And no one knows why that initial condition was what it was. That fact should be front-page news. It is not. It is buried in cosmology textbooks and discussed at specialized conferences and politely avoided in popular science communication because the implication is so uncomfortable that most physicists would rather not say it out loud. The arrow of time is not fundamental. It is contingent. It depends on something we cannot explain. And if we cannot explain why the universe started the way it did, we cannot fully explain why time moves forward. We just know that it does, and we know the equation that describes the direction. And that equation was written by a man who was so far ahead of his time that the scientific establishment tried to destroy him for it. Vienna, 1844. Ludwig Eduard Boltzmann was born on the night between Shrove Tuesday and Ash Wednesday, February 20th, the hinge between carnival and penance. He later joked that this explained his entire personality, the wild oscillation between exuberance and despair that would define his life and ultimately end it. His father was a tax official who died of tuberculosis when Ludwig was 15. His mother came from a prosperous Salzburg family. He was brilliant in the way that made people uncomfortable. At the University of Vienna, he studied under Joseph Stephan, who handed him James Clerk Maxwell's papers along with an English grammar book. Because Boltzmann could not read a word of English, he took piano lessons from Anton Bruckner. He was short, stout, and severely nearsighted, and he moved through the world with a kind of manic physical energy that his colleagues found either endearing or exhausting, depending on the day. His fiancée, Henriette von Egentler, called him her sweet fat darling in her letters. He proposed to her by letter on September 27th, 1875. They married the following July. They had 5 children. Their eldest son, Ludwig Hugo, died of appendicitis in 1889 at the age of 10. Boltzmann never fully recovered. As a lecturer, he was legendary. His philosophy lectures at the University of Vienna packed the largest hall on campus, students standing down the staircase, crowding the doors. Emperor Franz Joseph invited him to the palace to celebrate the sensation. Lise Meitner, who would later co-discover nuclear fission, passed her oral examination under Boltzmann on December 19, 1905, and spoke of his lectures with lifelong enthusiasm. Paul Ehrenfest credited Boltzmann's teaching with defining his entire career. Boltzmann had a literary flair that was unusual in physics. Describing Maxwell's equations, he wrote, "Ever higher soars the chaos of formulae. Suddenly we hear, as from kettle drums, the 4 beats put n equals 5, the evil spirit V vanishes, and that which had seemed insuperable has been overcome as if by a stroke of magic." 117 physicists contributed to his 60th birthday Festschrift in 1904. He was loved by his students. He was not loved by the establishment. Boltzmann's life was dominated by 2 publications and 1 war. The publications were his 1872 H-theorem paper, which gave the first explicit probabilistic expression for entropy, and his 1877 paper, which introduced the combinatorial argument connecting entropy to the count of microstates. The war was about whether atoms existed. I need you to understand how strange this sounds from the perspective of the 21st century. Atoms. the building blocks of chemistry, the foundation of material science, the thing you learned about in 5th grade. In Boltzmann's time, a significant fraction of the physics and chemistry establishment denied they were real. Ernst Mach, appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Vienna in 1895, regarded atoms as mental artifices, useful fictions, mathematical conveniences, but not things that actually existed in the physical world. Only directly observable quantities, like energy exchanges, were real. Wilhelm Ostwald, the German physical chemist who would win the Nobel Prize in 1909, went further. He wanted to abolish atoms entirely and rebuild all of physics on the sole foundation of energy. The movement was called energeticism, and at the height of its influence, it threatened to unmake everything Boltzmann had built. The confrontation erupted at the September 1895 meeting of the German Society of Scientists and Physicians in Lübeck. Arnold Sonnefeld, who was present, left an account that physicists still quote. He wrote, "The battle between Boltzmann and Ostwald resembled the battle of the bull with the supple fighter. However, this time, the bull defeated the torero in spite of his fighting art. The arguments of Boltzmann struck home. We, the young mathematicians of the time, were all on the side of Boltzmann. But winning a debate is not the same as winning a war. Mach had institutional power. Ostwald had a Nobel Prize and a movement behind him. And Boltzmann felt, year by year, that the tide was moving against him. Max Planck, who would later name his constant after Boltzmann, initially opposed Boltzmann's statistical approach. Planck later recalled, "I was not only indifferent, but to a certain extent even hostile to the atomic theory, which was the foundation of his entire research." Think about that. The man whose constant is literally the K in S equals K log W. The man who formalized the equation and had it carved on Boltzmann's tombstone was once hostile to the very idea that made the equation possible. Boltzmann's friend and former teacher, Joseph Loschmidt, delivered what should have been a fatal blow to the entire statistical mechanics program in 1876. Loschmidt pointed out something devastatingly simple. If every microscopic law of physics is time reversible, and Boltzmann's H theorem claims to derive irreversible entropy increase from those reversible laws, then something has gone wrong. You cannot get a one-way arrow out of two-way equations. If you could instantaneously reverse the velocity of every molecule in a gas, the gas would retrace its path back to any previous low-entropy state, in direct violation of what Boltzmann claimed to have proved. According to the physicist Mark Kack, Boltzmann's first response was pragmatic to the point of comedy. He reportedly said, "Go ahead, reverse them," which is true enough. Reversing the velocities of 10 to the 23 molecules simultaneously is not something you can actually do. But Boltzmann knew the objection cut deeper than that, and it forced him to make the conceptual leap that would define his legacy. Stimulated by Loschmidt's paradox, Boltzmann produced his 1877 paper, the paper that introduced W, the paper that shifted entropy from a deterministic proof to a statistical understanding. The second law was no longer a certainty. It was an overwhelming probability. Entropy decreasing states exist in principle. They are not forbidden by any law, but they are so extraordinarily rare, so fantastically improbable, that waiting for one to occur spontaneously in a macroscopic system would require times that dwarf the age of the universe by factors beyond comprehension. This was the revolution, and the establishment responded to it with indifference and hostility. Not because the mathematics was wrong, nobody could find a flaw in the mathematics, but because the implication that the laws of physics are fundamentally probabilistic, that certainty is an illusion of scale, that the arrow of time rests on a statistical foundation, was too uncomfortable to accept. The shift from deterministic to statistical was not a technical adjustment. It was a philosophical revolution, and I do not think most people appreciate how radical it was. Before Boltzmann's 1877 paper, the second law was treated as absolute. Heat flows from hot to cold, always, without exception. After Boltzmann, the second law became a statement about what is overwhelmingly likely. Heat almost always flows from hot to cold. The probability of a spontaneous flow from cold to hot is not zero. It is just so extraordinarily small that you will never observe it in the lifetime of the universe. To get a sense of how small, consider a simple example. Take a box of gas and divide it mentally into two halves, left and right. There are roughly 10 to the 23rd molecules in a mole of gas. The probability that all of them spontaneously end up in the left half is about 1 in 2 raised to the power of 10 to the 23. That number is so small that there is no physical analogy that can convey it. It is not just unlikely, it is a number so far beyond the capacity of the universe to explore that calling it unlikely is like calling the observable universe slightly larger than a grain of sand. But it is not zero. And that fact, the fact that the second law is statistical rather than absolute, has consequences that Boltzmann understood and that most physicists still find uncomfortable. It means that the irreversibility of macroscopic processes is not fundamental. It is emergent. It emerges from the statistics of enormous numbers of particles, not from any time asymmetric law operating at the microscopic level. The microscopic laws are perfectly reversible. Every single one. The irreversibility you observe, the arrow of time you experience, is an emergent statistical phenomenon that depends on the initial conditions. Zermelo raised a second objection in 1896 based on Poincaré's recurrence theorem, published by Henri Poincaré in 1890. The theorem proves that any finite classical system confined to a bounded region of phase space will eventually return arbitrarily close to its initial state. If you wait long enough, the gas will eventually return to whatever low entropy configuration it started in. Entropy must eventually decrease. The second law, according to Zermelo, is not just statistically approximate. It is, over sufficiently long timescales, false. Boltzmann accepted the mathematical validity of the recurrence objection. He could not deny Poincaré's theorem, which is rigorously proved, but he pointed out that the recurrence times for macroscopic systems are so incomprehensibly long that they are physically meaningless. For even a modest system, the recurrence time exceeds 10 to the power of 10 to the 19th years. That is not a number you can compare to the age of the universe. That is a number you cannot compare to anything. The universe would have to exist for a length of time that makes its current age look like the first Planck time, over and over again, for a number of repetitions that itself cannot be written using all the matter in the universe. Zermelo was mathematically correct and physically irrelevant. But the philosophical tension remains. The second law is the most reliable generalization in all of science. It has never been violated in any experiment, and yet it is, at its foundations, a statement about probability rather than certainty. The most important law in physics is not a law in the traditional sense. It is a bet, an extraordinarily good bet. the best bet in the history of science, a bet so safe that you can build an entire civilization's technology on it and never lose. But a bet nonetheless. And that ambiguity, that gap between the absolute reliability of the second law in practice and its probabilistic nature in principle, is something the physics community has never fully resolved. It is discussed in philosophy of physics seminars. It appears in footnotes and technical appendices. It does not appear in the version of entropy that you were taught in school, because the version you were taught does not contain footnotes. It contains certainty, and the certainty was manufactured because uncertainty about the foundations of time itself is not something anyone wants to print in a high school textbook. By 1898, Boltzmann was writing his own epitaph. In the preface to his lectures on gas theory, he wrote, "I am conscious of being only an individual struggling weakly against the stream of time, but it still remains in my power to contribute in such a way that when the theory of gases is again revived, not too much will have to be rediscovered." Read that again. When the theory of gases is again revived, he believed his work would be forgotten. He was writing instructions for the future physicists who would have to rediscover what he had already proven. He was preparing for his own erasure. Boltzmann almost certainly suffered from what we would now diagnose as bipolar disorder. He had his first nervous breakdown at 41 after his mother's death in 1885. During a period at Leipzig around 1900, he attempted suicide. By May of 1906, his condition had deteriorated so severely that the dean of his faculty described it as a serious form of neurasthenia, and he was forced to resign his position at Vienna. His wife Henriette insisted on a vacation. She hoped the sea air would help. They traveled with their youngest daughter, Elsa, who was 15, to the Hotel Plaers in Duino, a village on the Adriatic coast near Trieste. They were scheduled to return to Vienna the following day, on September 5th, 1906. While Henriette and Elsa went swimming in the bay, Ludwig Boltzmann hanged himself from the crossbar of a window casement in their hotel room, using a short cord. Elsa found the body when she returned, disturbed by his long absence. She never spoke of the discovery again. He was 62 years old. He left no note. The aftermath tells its own story. Boltzmann's funeral was held on September 10th in Vienna. The physics community sent condolences, but the attendance was modest. His chair at the University of Vienna was eventually filled, but the intellectual movement he represented, statistical mechanics, the reality of atoms, the probabilistic nature of physical law, continued to face resistance for years after his death. What haunts me about the timing is how close he came. Einstein's Brownian motion paper had been published in Annalen der Physik in May of 1905. It was available. It was in print. It was in the same journal that every physicist in the German-speaking world read. If someone had put it in Boltzmann's hands and said, "Look, this paper proves atoms are real, proves your life's work was correct, proves the molecules you have been counting are actual physical objects that collide and bounce and do exactly what your equations say they do," would it have been enough? I do not know. The depression that drove Boltzmann to his death was likely a clinical condition exacerbated by, but not solely caused by, professional rejection. But the timing is so narrow, so cruel, that it feels like the universe was running an experiment in how much irony a single life can contain. Between Boltzmann's death in September 1906 and Perrin's conclusive experiments in 1908, exactly 2 years passed, 24 months. If Boltzmann had held on for 2 more years, he would have lived to see his life's work validated by direct experimental evidence, so compelling that even Ostwald conceded. 2 years, in a career spanning 4 decades, fighting a battle spanning 2 more years, and he would have won in his own lifetime. Instead, the equation was carved on his tombstone, and the stone stands in the Central Friedhof, Group 14C, Grave 1, under a marble bust that captures his broad face and nearsighted squint, and the equation that Planck formulated and named and championed after the death of the man who made it possible, looks out over a cemetery where the other graves bear the names of Beethoven and Brahms and Schubert and Strauss. Boltzmann is buried among the composers. The man who heard in Maxwell's equations a symphony of kettle drums and vanishing evil spirits is buried among the musicians. And the equation on his stone is more fundamental than any note they ever wrote. And here is the part of this story that I personally think qualifies as the cruelest irony in the history of science. In May of 1905, 16 months before Boltzmann's death, Albert Einstein had published his paper on Brownian motion. The paper showed that the random jittering of microscopic particles suspended in fluid, something you can observe through an ordinary microscope, could be explained quantitatively by molecular collisions. It provided specific, testable predictions. If atoms exist, if molecules are real, then particles of a certain size in fluid of a certain viscosity should move in a specific, calculable way. And they do. Boltzmann apparently never learned of Einstein's paper. Between 1908 and 1909, the French physicist Jean Perrin performed meticulous experiments confirming Einstein's predictions. He determined Avogadro's number through multiple independent methods and provided irrefutable evidence for the reality of atoms. Perrin won the Nobel Prize in 1926. Ostwald conceded in 1908, writing in the 4th edition of his textbook, "The atomic hypothesis is thus raised to the position of a scientifically well-founded theory." Mach never conceded. He died in 1916, still unconvinced. Boltzmann's tombstone at the Vienna Zentralfriedhof was erected in the 1930s, after his vindication was complete. It bears a marble bust and the inscription S equals K log W. The equation on the stone was Planck's formulation, not Boltzmann's original. It was placed there at the initiative of Max Planck, the man who had once been hostile to Boltzmann's entire program. The equation carved on the tombstone was a reconciliation between 2 men whose work together created modern statistical physics, except one of them was dead and the other had to live with knowing he had been part of the culture that killed him. I want to stop here for a moment because I think the weight of this needs to land properly. A man proved the deepest truth in physics. He was attacked not because his mathematics was flawed, but because the conclusion was too uncomfortable. He internalized the rejection. He believed his own work would be forgotten. He killed himself in a hotel room while his daughter swam in the bay. And the equation they carved on his grave, the equation that the physics establishment erected as a monument to his genius after he was safely dead, is the same equation that explains why you are going to die. That is not a metaphor. That is what the math says. And the connection between Boltzmann's equation and your mortality is not a loose philosophical analogy. It is a precise, quantitative, experimentally verified chain of causation that runs from the statistics of molecular arrangements to the biochemistry of aging, to the thermodynamics of death, And if you follow that chain far enough, it does not stop at your death. It keeps going, all the way to the end of everything. In 1943, in the middle of a world war, an Austrian exile named Erwin Schrodinger stood at a lectern in Trinity College, Dublin, and asked a question that no physicist had any business asking. What is life? He was a quantum mechanic. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1933 for the Schrodinger equation, the foundational wave equation of quantum mechanics. He had no formal training in biology, and yet in February of that year, he delivered 3 lectures that would redirect the entire course of molecular biology. The lectures were published the following year as a slim book, fewer than 100 pages, by Cambridge University Press. It sold over 100,000 copies. The title was What is Life? And the central argument was thermodynamic. Schrodinger pointed out that living organisms appear to violate the second law. A fertilized egg develops into a complex organism. Cells divide and differentiate. Muscles contract. Brains think. All of these processes create and maintain local order, local structure, local low entropy states. If entropy always increases, how is any of this possible? Schrodinger's answer was elegant and disturbing. An organism, he wrote, feeds upon negative entropy, attracting a stream of negative entropy upon itself to compensate the entropy increase it produces by living, and thus to maintain itself on a stationary and fairly low entropy level. Living things do not violate the second law, they obey it scrupulously. They consume low entropy energy, structured food, ordered sunlight, and they export high entropy waste, heat, carbon dioxide, disordered water. They maintain their internal order by paying the entropy tax to their surroundings. The total entropy of the system, organism plus environment, always increases. The organism simply arranges for the increase to happen outside its boundaries. You are a Maxwell's demon. That is what Schrodinger was saying. You are a molecular sorting machine, taking in structured energy and using it to push your internal entropy down, to repair your DNA, to fold your proteins, to maintain the electrochemical gradients across your cell membranes that allow your neurons to fire and your heart to beat. And every single act of sorting, every repair, every fold, every gradient maintained generates entropy that has to be dumped into the environment. You stay alive by making the universe messier. That is the deal. That is the only deal available. And the deal has a cost that accumulates. James Watson, who would co-discover the structure of DNA in 1953, wrote that from the moment he read Schrodinger's What is Life, he became polarized toward finding out the secret of the gene. Francis Crick called the book peculiarly influential and wrote directly to Schrodinger on August 12, 1953, after the DNA structure discovery, saying, Watson and I were once discussing how we came to enter the field of molecular biology, and we discovered that we had both been influenced by your little book. Maurice Wilkins reported the same. Schrodinger's proposal that hereditary material was an aperiodic crystal containing a code script anticipated the structure of DNA by a decade. The man who wrote the wave equation of quantum mechanics pointed biology toward the double helix by thinking about entropy. I need to make this concrete because the abstraction can hide the reality. You are sitting somewhere right now, reading this or listening to this, and while you are doing that, your body is performing approximately 10 quadrillion chemical reactions per second. 10 to the 16th. That is not a metaphor or an approximation for dramatic effect. That is the estimated total metabolic activity of a human body at rest. 10 quadrillion reactions every second just to keep you at your current level of organization. Each of those reactions is governed by thermodynamics. Each one consumes or releases energy. Each one moves entropy from one place to another. Your body is a factory running 10 quadrillion parallel processes every second, all of them aimed at one goal: keeping your internal entropy lower than the entropy of your surroundings. The moment those processes stop, even for a few minutes, the entropy gradient between you and your environment begins to equalize. Your body temperature starts to drift toward room temperature. Your cells lose their ion gradients. Your proteins begin to denature. Your DNA, freed from the repair machinery that kept it functional, begins to degrade. You become, in the language of thermodynamics, an equilibrium system. You become the same temperature, the same chemical composition, the same entropy level as your surroundings. That is what death looks like from the perspective of the second law. It is not a failure of a specific organ or a specific process. It is the cessation of the global entropy management system that kept all the organs and all the processes running. Death is equilibrium. Life is the sustained, energetically expensive, thermodynamically improbable state of being, out of equilibrium with your environment. Prigoghine's insight was that systems far from thermodynamic equilibrium can spontaneously develop organized structures. He called them dissipative structures because they exist only by dissipating energy, only by increasing the total entropy of the universe. A whirlpool in a draining bathtub is a dissipative structure. It is organized, it has a definite form, but it exists only because water is flowing through it. Stop the flow and the whirlpool vanishes. You are the same, more complex, more beautiful, more astonishing in your organization, but thermodynamically the same. You exist because energy flows through you. Cut the flow and you vanish. And the flow degrades the vessel. This is the part that makes entropy personal. The very process of maintaining your organization, of running 10 quadrillion chemical reactions per second, generates byproducts that damage the machinery performing the maintenance. Reactive oxygen species, the free radicals that every health magazine warns you about, are not foreign invaders. They are waste products of mitochondrial respiration, the same process that generates the ATP that powers your cells. The engine that keeps you alive produces exhaust that corrodes the engine. This is not a design flaw. It is a thermodynamic necessity. There is no way to extract work from an energy source without generating waste heat. And in a biological system, some of that waste takes the form of molecules reactive enough to damage DNA, proteins, and lipid membranes. Your mitochondria, the organelles that perform cellular respiration, have their own DNA separate from the nuclear DNA in the cell's nucleus. Mitochondrial DNA is particularly vulnerable because it sits right next to the electron transport chain, the molecular machinery that generates most of the reactive oxygen species. Mitochondrial DNA accumulates mutations at roughly 10 times the rate of nuclear DNA. Over decades, this accumulation degrades mitochondrial function. The organelles become less efficient at generating energy. They leak more reactive oxygen species. The damage accelerates. This is one of the leading theories of biological aging, and it is fundamentally thermodynamic. The entropy-generating machinery degrades from its own entropy generation. But Schrödinger's insight cuts deeper than he may have realized. Because if you are a thermodynamic system maintaining low entropy by exporting waste heat, then aging is not some mysterious biological process separate from physics. Aging is the gradual failure of the entropy management system. Aging is what happens when the Maxwell's demon gets tired. Every cell in your body sustains approximately 70,000 DNA lesions per day. 70,000 per cell per day. These come from hydrolysis, the spontaneous breakdown of chemical bonds by water, from oxidative damage by reactive oxygen species, which are byproducts of the very mitochondrial respiration that keeps you alive. The machinery that generates your energy also generates the molecules that damage your DNA. The engine wears out the engine, and from replication errors, because every time a cell divides, 3.2 billion base pairs have to be copied, and the copying machinery, as precise as it is not perfect. Fewer than 1 in 1,000 of these lesions become permanent mutations. The rest are repaired by an elaborate molecular machinery so important that the 2015 Nobel Prize in Chemistry went to Thomas Landauer, Paul Modrich, and Aziz Sankar for elucidating its mechanisms. But the repairs are imperfect. Damage accumulates. The error rate is not zero, and over decades, the errors compound. Protein misfolding follows the same thermodynamic logic. Every protein in your body exists in a specific three-dimensional shape, the native fold, which represents a free energy minimum. But many proteins are expressed near their supersaturation limits. Their native states are metastable, meaning they are sitting in a local energy well, not the deepest possible well. With age, with oxidative stress, with accumulating mutations in the genes that code for them, proteins misfold. They aggregate. They form structures called amyloid fibrils, tangled masses of misfolded protein that the cell cannot clear. And here is the part that should unsettle you. The amyloid fibrils, the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, of Parkinson's, of Huntington's, are actually the most thermodynamically stable protein structures at high concentration. The native fold, the functional shape your body needs, is the metastable state. The amyloid tangle, the disease state, is the equilibrium. Your proteins are not breaking. They are relaxing into their lowest energy configuration. They are doing exactly what the second law says they should do. The diseases of aging are thermodynamic inevitabilities. Leonard Hayflick and Paul Moorhead discovered in 1961 at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia that normal human cells do not divide forever. They divide between 40 and 60 times, and then they stop permanently. This is the Hayflick limit, named by Sir Macfarlane Burnet in 1974. The mechanism involves telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes. Every time a cell divides, it loses between 50 and 200 base pairs of telomere sequence. When the telomeres reach a critical length, the DNA damage response triggers permanent growth arrest. The cell becomes senescent. It stops dividing, but it does not die. It sits there, secreting inflammatory molecules, damaging its neighbors, accumulating like debris. Elizabeth Blackburn, Jack Szostak, and Carol Greider won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for discovering telomerase, the enzyme that can rebuild telomeres. It is active in roughly 90% of cancer cells, which is how they achieve immortality. But it is silent in most of your somatic cells. Your body has the enzyme that could prevent telomere shortening. It chooses not to use it in most of your tissues. The current understanding is that this is a cancer suppression mechanism. If every cell could divide indefinitely, the mutation rate would make cancer inevitable even earlier than it already is. So your body accepts aging as the price of not dying of cancer in childhood. The second law forces a trade. There is no configuration where you win. There is a concept in gerontology called antagonistic pleiotropy, first proposed by George Williams in 1957. It means that the same genes that help you survive and reproduce when you are young can harm you when you are old. A gene that promotes rapid cell division in childhood, building organs and healing wounds, becomes a liability in old age because it increases cancer risk. A gene that promotes inflammatory immune responses against infections becomes damaging when it triggers chronic inflammation in aging tissues. Evolution selects for genes that maximize reproductive success, not lifespan. And since most organisms in the wild die of predation, disease, or starvation long before old age, there is almost no evolutionary pressure to select against genes that cause harm after reproductive age. This is thermodynamics wearing a different mask. Evolution, like the second law, does not optimize for longevity. It optimizes for something else entirely: reproductive fitness, and the structures it builds are optimized for that purpose, not for durability. Your body was not designed to last. It was designed to reproduce. The fact that you experience aging as a slow betrayal, a body that once served you faithfully gradually failing at every level, is not a design flaw. It is the design. Natural selection built you to be a dissipative structure optimized for a specific function. And once that function is complete, the maintenance budget declines. The numbers bear this out with uncomfortable precision. After age 30, your maximum oxygen consumption declines by roughly 1% per year. Your cardiac output drops by roughly 1% per year. Your kidney function decreases by roughly 1% per year. Your bone density declines. Your muscle mass decreases. Your lens hardens. Your skin thins. Your immune system weakens. None of these declines are caused by a single gene or a single mechanism. They are systemic. They are the accumulated consequence of running a thermodynamic system for decades without being able to fully repair the damage generated by its own operation. And there is a deeper irony here that connects back to the Schrodinger thread. Schrodinger said organisms feed on negative entropy. He was right. But the feeding itself generates damage. The very process of consuming low entropy food and exporting high entropy waste, the process that keeps you alive, produces the reactive oxygen species that damage your DNA, the mechanical forces that wear your joints, the metabolic byproducts that accumulate in your cells. You cannot eat without generating waste. You cannot generate energy without generating damage. The price of life is aging. The price of aging is death. And the price is set by the second law. Walter Bortz published a paper in Experimental Gerontology in 1986 called Aging as Entropy. His argument was direct. The homeostatic controls which order our existence are energy dependent. As energies diminish, homeostasis as order deteriorates, aging proceeds, and life is threatened. Aging is not a program. It is not coded into your DNA the way eye color is coded. It is the default outcome of being a thermodynamic system in a universe governed by the second law. Your body does not age because it is supposed to. It ages because maintaining low entropy requires continuous energy expenditure, and the machinery that performs that expenditure is itself subject to entropy increase. In 2008, Carlos Silva and Kalyan Annamalai published a paper in the journal Entropy called Entropy Generation and Human Aging. They calculated the total entropy generated by a human body over an entire lifespan. The number they arrived at was approximately 11,404 kilojoules per Kelvin per kilogram of body mass. Using this thermodynamic framework, they predicted average lifespans of 73.78 years for males and 81.61 years for females. These predictions matched actuarial life tables to within a few years. They predicted human lifespan from thermodynamics, not from genetics, not from epidemiology, not from medicine. From the second law. I need to pause here because I think the sheer weight of this tends to get lost in the specifics. Your body is a dissipative structure. That term was coined by Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977 for his work on the thermodynamics of systems far from equilibrium. A dissipative structure is an ordered state that exists only because energy is continuously flowing through it. A candle flame is a dissipative structure. A hurricane is a dissipative structure. You are a dissipative structure. The difference between you and a candle flame is complexity, not kind. Cut off the energy flow and the structure collapses. That is what death is. Death is the moment when the organism can no longer maintain the thermodynamic disequilibrium necessary for life. As Schrodinger wrote, death is the decay into thermodynamical equilibrium. The organism reaches equilibrium with its surroundings, and the second law, held at bay for decades by continuous energy expenditure, completes its work. An adult human body produces approximately 10 million joules per day as waste heat. That heat carries roughly 480 joules per Kelvin per liter per day of entropy into the environment. Without this constant entropy export, your body temperature would climb until your membranes disassembled, your proteins denatured, and you died. You are a furnace. You burn to stay ordered, and when the furnace goes out, the ordering stops. The entropy generation rate in infants is 3 times higher than in the elderly. The young burn hotter. They are building structure at a furious rate, assembling organs, growing bones, wiring neural circuits, and every joule of ordering work generates entropy that has to be exported. As you age, the metabolic rate declines. The entropy generation slows. The structure maintenance becomes less vigorous. The accumulated damage from 70,000 DNA lesions per cell per day, from protein misfolding, from telomere shortening, from mitochondrial dysfunction, gradually overwhelms the repair capacity. The Maxwell's demon tires, the sorting slows, the gradients dissipate, the flame flickers. And this is not unique to biology. This is not a special feature of carbon-based chemistry or the peculiarities of DNA replication. This is the second law applied to a specific class of thermodynamic systems. Any structure, biological or otherwise, that maintains itself through continuous energy dissipation will eventually fail. The maintenance machinery is itself subject to the same entropic degradation it is fighting against. The demon has to erase its memory to complete each sorting cycle, and each erasure generates entropy, and the entropy accumulates, and eventually the cost of running the demon exceeds the benefit of the sorting. That connection between information and entropy is not an analogy. It is an identity, and it was proven in the most unexpected way. In 1867, James Clerk Maxwell wrote a letter to Peter Guthrie Tait, proposing what would become the most famous thought experiment in thermodynamics. Imagine a tiny being, Maxwell wrote, stationed at a hole in a partition between two gas chambers. The being watches molecules approach the hole and selectively opens or closes a door, allowing fast molecules to pass one way and slow molecules the other. Without expending any work, the being creates a temperature difference from uniform gas, hot on one side, cold on the other. A temperature gradient from equilibrium, an apparent violation of the second law. Maxwell called it a finite being. Lord Kelvin named it a demon in 1874. The thought experiment haunted physics for over a century. Leo Szilard made the first rigorous connection between the demon and information in his 1920 paper in Zeitschrift für Physik. He argued that the demon's measurements must carry an entropy cost of at least k times the natural log of 2 per bit of information acquired. But Szilard could not identify precisely where the entropy was generated. The answer came from an unlikely source. In 1961, Rolf Landauer of IBM published a paper in the IBM Journal of Research and Development called Irreversibility and Heat Generation in the Computing Process. His principle is now one of the most important results in the physics of information. Erasing one bit of information dissipates at minimum kT times the natural log of 2 of energy as heat. At room temperature, 300 Kelvin, this equals approximately 2.87 times 10 to the negative 21 joules, about 0.018 electron volts. The logic is clean. Erasing a bit means taking a system that could be in one of two states and forcing it into a single known state. That halves the phase space. It reduces entropy by k log 2. The second law demands that this entropy appears somewhere else, so it appears as heat. Charles Bennett of IBM completed the resolution of Maxwell's demon in his 1982 paper, The Thermodynamics of Computation. Bennett showed that measurement itself can in principle be done reversibly without generating entropy. The irreversible step is not acquiring the information. It is erasing the demon's memory. The demon observes each molecule. It records the observation. It acts on the observation. Over time, its memory fills up. To return to its initial state and complete the thermodynamic cycle, the demon must erase its memory. Each bit of erasure generates kT log 2 of waste heat. The entropy bill from the erasures exactly cancels the entropy reduction from the molecular sorting. The second law survives. This was experimentally confirmed in 2012. Antoine Beroux and colleagues used a colloidal particle, a 2 micrometer silica bead, trapped in a modulated double-well optical potential as a 1-bit memory. They published in Nature, volume 483, pages 187 through 189, March 8, 2012, demonstrating that the mean dissipated heat saturates at the Landauer bound in the limit of long erasure cycles. The minimum thermodynamic cost of forgetting is real. It has been measured. It is not a theory. It is a fact. And that fact connects to everything I have been telling you about aging. Your cells are information processing systems. Your DNA is an information storage medium. Your enzymes are molecular computers executing programs written in amino acid sequences. And every computation your body performs, every DNA repair, every protein fold, every nerve impulse, every act of molecular sorting that keeps you alive generates a minimum amount of waste heat that cannot be avoided even in principle. The Landauer limit is the floor. The actual cost is far higher, roughly 1,000 times the Landauer limit for current biological processes. But the floor exists, and it means that the thermodynamic cost of being alive, of processing the information necessary to maintain your structure, is not zero and can never be zero. Claude Shannon published A Mathematical Theory of Communication in the Bell System Technical Journal in July and October of 1948. His formula for information entropy, H equals negative the sum of pi log pi, is mathematically identical to the Gibbs entropy formula in statistical mechanics. S equals negative kb times the sum of pi log pi, differing only by the constant kb and the choice of logarithmic base. The story persists that John von Neumann told Shannon to call his quantity entropy because, and I am paraphrasing here, nobody knows what entropy really is. So in a debate, you will always have the advantage. Whether that conversation actually happened is disputed, but the mathematical identity is not disputed. Thermodynamic entropy and information entropy are the same thing measured in different units. E.T. Jaynes demonstrated in 1957 that thermodynamic entropy is Shannon information entropy applied to physical systems. It measures the amount of information you would need to specify the exact microstate if you only know the macrostate. Landauer crystallized the implications in a 1991 Physics Today article titled simply, "Information is Physical." Information is not a disembodied abstract entity, he wrote. It is always tied to a physical representation. Erasing it has a cost. Storing it has a cost. Processing it has a cost. And all of those costs are entropic. John Archibald Wheeler, one of the most influential physicists of the 20th century, went furthest. In 1990, he declared it from bit. Every particle, every field of force, even the space-time continuum itself, derives its function, its meaning, its very existence entirely from apparatus-elicited answers to yes or no questions, binary choices, bits. And if information is physical, and if entropy measures the gap between what you know and what is actually happening, then the connection between S equals K log W and your own consciousness is not metaphorical. Your thoughts are physical processes, your memories are physical states. Your experience of being alive is a pattern of information maintained at enormous thermodynamic cost in a universe that has no interest in maintaining it. The universe does not care about your mind. The second law does not make exceptions for consciousness. You are information, arranged in a particular pattern, sustained by continuous energy expenditure. And the second law says that the arrangement is temporary. And now I need to take you to the place where all of this converges. Because the same equation that explains why you age, the same thermodynamic logic that predicts your lifespan to within a few years, the same second law that turns your proteins into tangles and shortens your telomeres and degrades your mitochondria, applies at cosmological scales. And when you follow it there, the conclusion is not ambiguous. Jeremy England, then a physicist at MIT, published Statistical Physics of Self-Replication in the Journal of Chemical Physics in 2013. He derived a thermodynamic lower bound for the heat production during self-replication. His broader proposal that under certain conditions matter spontaneously restructures itself to more efficiently dissipate absorbed energy led him to suggest that life is as unsurprising as rocks rolling downhill. Life is not a violation of the second law. Life is a mechanism by which the second law operates more efficiently. You are not resisting entropy. You are an instrument of entropy. You dissipate energy gradients faster than dead matter would. The universe did not create life in spite of the second law. It may have created life because of it. Think about what that means for a moment. You feel like you are fighting entropy. You eat, you exercise, you repair, you maintain. You feel like you are holding the line against decay. But from the perspective of the second law, you are accelerating decay. You are converting low entropy sunlight into high entropy heat faster than a rock would. You are a more efficient entropy-producing machine than bare dirt. The purpose you feel, the drive to survive, the will to maintain your structure, may itself be a thermodynamic phenomenon. The universe may have produced you not to resist entropy, but to increase it. I want to be explicit about what this means for you, because the abstraction can serve as a kind of emotional buffer, and I think you deserve to feel the weight of it. Every memory you have ever formed was an act of entropy reduction inside your brain. Neurons fired in specific patterns, synapses strengthened, proteins were synthesized and transported to specific locations at specific times. All of that required energy. All of that generated waste heat. All of that increased the entropy of the universe, while decreasing the entropy of one small region of your skull. Your memories are thermodynamic sculptures, carved in neural tissue at the cost of entropy exported to your surroundings. And those sculptures degrade. Synaptic connections weaken without reinforcement. Proteins are recycled. Neural patterns drift. This is why memories fade, not because the information is overwritten or lost in some computational sense, because the low entropy configuration that encoded the memory is subject to the same thermodynamic forces that degrade every other low entropy configuration. Your childhood memories are thermodynamically unstable. They exist only because continuous maintenance processes keep them coherent. When those maintenance processes falter, as they do with age, the memories dissolve, the information disperses, the entropy increases. Every thought you think right now is a thermodynamic event. The neurons firing as you process this sentence are consuming glucose, pumping ions across membranes, dissipating heat, increasing the total entropy of the universe. The act of understanding is not free. It has a thermodynamic cost, and that cost is paid in the only currency the second law accepts: an increase in the total entropy of the system. Landauer's principle tells you the minimum cost. Every bit of information your brain processes, every binary distinction it makes, every yes or no decision at the molecular level, costs at minimum kT log 2 of energy, about 3 times 10 to the negative 21 joules at body temperature. Your brain processes roughly 10 to the 16th bits per second. The minimum thermodynamic cost of that processing is roughly 3 times 10 to the negative 5th joules per second, a negligible fraction of your brain's actual energy consumption of about 20 watts. Your brain is currently operating at roughly 1 billion times the Landauer limit, but the limit exists, and it means that even a perfectly efficient brain, a brain operating at the absolute theoretical minimum of energy dissipation, would still generate entropy, would still contribute to the heat death, would still be paying the tax. You are not just a witness to the second law, you are an agent of it. Every thought you think, every memory you form, every emotion you feel, increases the total entropy of the universe. You are a mechanism by which the universe approaches equilibrium. The fact that this mechanism feels like consciousness, feels like purpose, feels like meaning, does not change the thermodynamics. The thermodynamics does not care what the mechanism feels like. It only cares about the numbers. And the numbers say that your mind, like your body, like your star, like your galaxy, is a temporary configuration of matter and energy that is moving with statistical certainty toward dissolution. There is one more thread I want to pull before we reach the end, and it is the thread that connects everything I have told you about information, about biology, about time, into a single picture. Jacob Bekenstein discovered in 1972 and 73 that black holes have entropy proportional to the area of their event horizons, not the volume, the area. This was formalized in the Bekenstein-Hawking entropy formula, S equals Kb times C cubed times A, divided by 4 times h bar times g, where A is the area of the event horizon, C is the speed of light, h bar is the reduced Planck constant, and g is Newton's gravitational constant. The entropy of a black hole is proportional to the area of its surface, not its interior. This result, which was initially seen as a mathematical curiosity, turned out to have shattering implications. Bekenstein showed that there is a maximum amount of information that can be contained in any region of space. The Bekenstein bound, published in 1981, states that the total entropy, and therefore the total information content, of a region is limited by the area of the region's boundary, not its volume. Gerard Hooft in 1993 and Leonard Susskind in 1995 generalized this into the holographic principle, that all the information in a three-dimensional volume can be encoded on its two-dimensional boundary surface. Think about what this means. The total information content of the observable universe is not infinite. It is bounded. The Bekenstein bound gives a finite maximum for the total number of bits that can be stored in the observable universe. And that number, while enormous, is specific. It is a real number with real units that can be calculated. The universe has a finite information capacity, and when that capacity is reached, when every bit is filled, when there are no more distinctions left to make, the universe has reached maximum entropy. It has reached the heat death. The holographic principle connects Boltzmann's 19th century equation about gas molecules to 21st century theories about the nature of space-time itself. The W in S equals K log W is not just counting molecular arrangements. It is counting the fundamental degrees of freedom of reality. The entropy of the universe is a measure of how much of the total information capacity has been filled. And the second law says it fills up. It fills up because the number of full configurations is larger than the number of empty ones. The same statistical logic that governs a box of gas governs the information content of the cosmos. This is what I meant at the beginning when I said that what entropy actually measures should disturb you. It is not disorder, it is not messiness. It is the number of ways reality can be arranged beneath the surface of what you observe, and that number grows. At every scale, in every domain, from the proteins in your cells to the stars in your galaxy, to the information content of the observable universe, the W always grows. And growth in W means growth in S. And growth in S means the arrow of time moves forward. And the arrow moving forward means you age, stars burn out, black holes evaporate, and the universe goes dark. One equation, one direction, one outcome. And this is where the story stops being about you and starts being about everything. Because the process that is happening inside your cells, the gradual degradation of structure, The slow march toward equilibrium is happening everywhere, in every star, in every galaxy, in every corner of the observable universe. And unlike you, the universe does not have an environment to export its entropy to. The universe is the system. There is no outside. The entropy of the universe increases, and there is nowhere for it to go except into the universe itself. And the end state of that process has a name. It is called the heat death of the universe, and the name is the greatest misnomer in all of physics, because the heat death is not hot, it is cold. It is the coldest thing that will ever exist, and it is coming. The concept was first articulated by Lord Kelvin on April 19th, 1852. In a paper called On a Universal Tendency in Nature to the Dissipation of Mechanical Energy, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Hermann von Helmholtz elaborated it 2 years later, coining the German term Warmethod, heat death. The name stuck, and it has confused people ever since, because the end state is not a universe on fire. It is a universe at rest, maximum entropy, thermodynamic equilibrium, no energy gradients, no temperature differences, no possibility of work, no change, nothing happening anywhere ever again. The current temperature of the cosmic microwave background, the faint afterglow of the Big Bang that fills all of space, is 2.72548 Kelvin, plus or minus 0.00057 Kelvin. That measurement comes from the Fixon 2009 paper in the Astrophysical Journal, volume 707, page 916. 2.7 Kelvin. That is already just 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. The universe is already almost dead. We are living in the last warm moments. But those last warm moments will last a very, very long time by human standards. And the journey from here to the final state passes through stages so strange and so vast that the human mind was not built to comprehend them. I am going to walk you through them anyway, because I think you deserve to know where this is going. The numbers are real, the timescales are published. The physics is not speculative. This is what the equations say. Fred Adams and Gregory Laughlin mapped the future of the universe in their 1997 paper in Reviews of Modern Physics, volume 69, page 337, and in their 1990 book, The 5 Ages of the Universe. They measured time in what they called cosmological decades, where the nth decade corresponds to 10 to the n years. We are currently living in what they called the Stelliferous era, the age of stars which began shortly after the Big Bang and will last until roughly 10 to the 14th years from now. That is 100 trillion years. It sounds like forever, but it is not. It is a finite number, and when it arrives, the last star will burn out. The longest-lived stars are red dwarfs, dim, cool, miserly with their fuel. A red dwarf with roughly 8% of the sun's mass can burn for over 10 trillion years. When the last red dwarf exhausts its hydrogen fuel and contracts into a white dwarf, the universe will go dark. Not metaphorically, actually dark. There will be no more fusion, no more starlight, no more visible light of any kind anywhere. The Stelliferous era will be over, and it will have lasted for roughly 1/10,000% of the universe's total lifespan. Think about that. Everything that has ever happened in the history of the universe, every galaxy forming, every star igniting, every planet coalescing, every molecule assembling, every organism evolving, every civilization rising, every thought being thought, all of that occurred in the first 1/10,000th of 1% of the time the universe will exist. Everything you have ever known, everything humanity has ever accomplished, everything any intelligent species anywhere in the observable universe has ever done, fits into a rounding error at the beginning. I want to make that scale comparison visceral because the numbers are so large that they slide off the mind without leaving a mark. Imagine the entire future lifespan of the universe compressed into a single calendar year, January 1st through December 31st. On that calendar, the stelliferous era, the age of stars, the only era in which anything remotely interesting happens, the era that contains all of human history and all possible future human history, occupies the first 5 milliseconds after midnight on January 1st, 5/1000ths of a second. The remaining 364 days, 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59.995 seconds are darkness, silence, cooling, evaporation, the slow unwinding of the last organized structures in an expanding void. Your entire life on that calendar is so brief that it cannot be meaningfully represented. It is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a millisecond. The entire history of the universe, from the Big Bang to right now, 13.8 billion years, is roughly 3.5 milliseconds on that calendar. The future you are worried about, the next 50 years, the next 100, the next 1,000, registers as a fluctuation in the last decimal place of the first millisecond. And yet, here you are, in that millisecond, aware of it, thinking about it, holding in your mind a picture of the entire future timeline, the dark eras, the evaporating black holes, the drifting positronium, the silence. You are a structure that arose in the first 5 milliseconds and became complex enough to contemplate the remaining 364 days. There is something in that fact that I do not think physics can fully account for. Not because physics is wrong, but because the categories physics uses, entropy, temperature, energy, equilibrium, do not contain a variable for the experience of knowing what entropy means. The equations tell you what will happen. They do not tell you what it is like to know what will happen. And the difference between those two things is, I think, the space in which everything that matters to you actually lives. But the equations do not care about that space. The equations do not care about what it is like. The equations care about W, and W grows. The stelliferous era is the only era in which the energy gradients are steep enough to power chemistry, biology, evolution, and thought. Once the stars die, the gradients flatten, the energy becomes diffuse. The temperature differences that drive every engine, every metabolism, every neural computation shrink towards zero. Life as we understand it becomes thermodynamically impossible, not just difficult, not just unlikely, impossible, because life requires free energy, energy available to do work, and free energy requires a temperature difference, and temperature differences require entropy gradients, and entropy gradients are exactly what the second law eliminates. After the stars die, the universe enters what Adams and Laughlin called the degenerate era, lasting from roughly 10 to the 15th to 10 to the 39th years. The only objects that remain are stellar corpses, white dwarfs, neutron stars, brown dwarfs, black holes. The white dwarfs cool slowly, radiating away their residual heat into the expanding void. Brown dwarfs, objects too small to have ever ignited fusion, drift in the darkness. Occasionally, two brown dwarfs might collide and briefly ignite, a flash of fusion lasting a few billion years in a universe of unimaginable darkness. These collisions would be the only events, brief sparks in an ocean of black. If protons decay, and there is theoretical reason to believe they might, with a half-life estimated somewhere between 10 to the 32nd and 10 to the 41st years, then the white dwarfs and neutron stars will slowly dissolve. A white dwarf powered by proton decay would generate roughly 400 watts of energy. 400 watts. That is a few light bulbs. An entire galaxy's worth of these dying embers would produce less total luminosity than a single ordinary star produces today. 400 watts per stellar corpse, scattered across a galaxy 100,000 light-years wide, in a universe expanding faster than light can cross it. That is the degenerate era. I want to dwell on the degenerate era for a moment, because it illustrates something about entropy that the shorter timescales of human life can obscure. During the degenerate era, the universe is not dead. Things are happening. White dwarfs are slowly cooling. Occasionally, gravitational interactions fling a planet out of its dead solar system and into the void. Occasionally, two stellar remnants collide, but the rate of events slows with each passing cosmological decade. The universe becomes less and less interesting per unit time. Entropy is still increasing, but the rate of increase is slowing because there are fewer and fewer gradients left to exploit. The universe is not rushing toward equilibrium, it is drifting there. Slowly, asymptotically, the way a ball rolling across an infinite flat plane gradually loses its velocity to friction. It never quite stops in finite time, but it gets closer and closer to stopping, and the difference between its motion and perfect stillness becomes unmeasurable. This gradual fading, this slow fade to black, is in some ways more unsettling than a dramatic end. A supernova is quick, a black hole collision is violent, but the heat death is patient. It does not destroy structure, it erodes it, atom by atom, photon by photon, degree by degree, over timescales so long that every dramatic event in the history of the universe, every gamma-ray burst, every galactic collision, every mass extinction, every Big Bang itself, fits into the first infinitesimal fraction of the total timeline. And during all of that slow fading, the second law is doing exactly what Boltzmann said it would do. The number of accessible microstates is growing. The macrostate is migrating toward the configuration with the most ways of being arranged. The W in S equals K log W is increasing. Slowly, relentlessly, statistically, inevitably. Not because anything is pushing it, but because the larger number is larger. That is all the second law has ever said. The larger number wins. And at cosmological scales, over cosmological timescales, the larger number is the one where nothing is happening. And then even that ends. The protons decay. The neutron stars evaporate. The white dwarfs dissolve. And the universe enters the black hole era, from roughly 10 to the 40th to 10 to the 100th years. The only organized structures remaining are black holes, but black holes do not last forever. In 1974, Stephen Hawking published a paper in Nature, volume 248, pages 30 through 31, dated March 1st. The title was Black Hole Explosions, with a question mark that belied the certainty of the mathematics. Hawking showed that black holes are not truly black. Quantum effects near the event horizon cause them to emit radiation at a temperature inversely proportional to their mass. A black hole radiates. It loses mass. It shrinks. And eventually, after an almost inconceivable span of time, it evaporates entirely, converting its remaining mass into a final burst of radiation. The evaporation time scales as the cube of the black hole's mass. A stellar mass black hole, roughly 3 times the mass of the Sun, would take approximately 10 to the 67th years to evaporate. Write that number out and try to comprehend it. 10 followed by 67 zeros. The current age of the universe is about 1.4 times 10 to the 10th years. 10 to the 67th is so much larger that the age of the universe is essentially 0 by comparison. And that is the small black holes. The supermassive black holes at the centers of galaxies, objects with billions of times the mass of the Sun, would take approximately 10 to the 100th years to evaporate. A Google years 10, followed by 100 zeros. Currently, all astrophysical black holes are actually colder than the cosmic microwave background. A 3 solar mass black hole has a Hawking temperature of roughly 10 to the negative 7th Kelvin, while the CMB is at 2.7 Kelvin. The black holes are colder than the background radiation, which means they are currently absorbing more energy than they emit. They are growing, not shrinking. Net evaporation will not begin until the CMB cools below the Hawking temperature of each black hole, which will take roughly 10 to the 19th years, give or take. After that, the slow evaporation begins. And then, after the last black hole evaporates in a whisper of photons, the universe enters its final state. Adams and Laughlin called it the dark era. Beyond 10 to the 100th years, nothing remains but photons of enormous wavelength stretching across distances that dwarf the current observable universe. Neutrinos, essentially invisible, almost massless, traveling at nearly the speed of light through absolute emptiness. And occasionally, an electron and a positron, drifting in the void, might find each other and form a positronium atom, a bound state with a diameter measured in trillions of light years, orbiting each other at velocities so slow that a single orbit takes longer than the current age of the universe. These positronium atoms eventually annihilate on timescales of roughly 10 to the 145th years, converting into photons that redshift into nothingness. That is the heat death. Not fire, not explosion, not drama. Silence. Absolute, permanent, thermodynamic silence. No energy gradients, no temperature differences, no possibility of doing work, no change, no events, effectively no time. Because time, as Eddington showed, is a property of entropy alone. When entropy reaches its maximum, when there are no more microstates to migrate to, when the universe has settled into its most probable macrostate and there is no statistical driving force in any direction, the arrow of time dissolves. Not into the past, not into the future, into nothing. And the mathematics says this is not a possibility. It is the outcome. The second law has never been violated. Not once, in any experiment, at any scale, in any laboratory, in any corner of the observable universe. Every attempt to build a perpetual motion machine has failed. Every apparent violation has been resolved as a bookkeeping error. Entropy being generated somewhere, the experimenter forgot to look. The second law is, as Eddington said, supreme. And the supreme law says that thermodynamic equilibrium is the destination. But there is one more layer to this, and it is the one that I personally find the most unsettling. In the late 1890s, Boltzmann himself proposed an idea that was meant to save the second law from Zermelo's recurrence objection. If the universe is eternal, and mostly in thermal equilibrium, Boltzmann suggested, then our observed low entropy region might simply be a rare fluctuation, a random dip in the entropy of a small part of an otherwise dead universe. We exist because we happen to be in a pocket where entropy is temporarily low, and we observe the arrow of time because entropy is increasing back toward the equilibrium we fluctuated away from. It sounds clever. It is actually devastating, because in 2004, Andreas Albrecht and Lorenzo Sorbo published a paper in Physical Review D, Volume 70, Article 063, 528, that exposed the fatal flaw. If the universe is in eternal thermal equilibrium, and fluctuations are responsible for the ordered structures we observe, then the most common fluctuations that produce conscious observers would not be entire galaxies full of stars and planets and evolving civilizations. The most common fluctuations would be single brains, a disembodied brain, complete with false memories of a life it never lived, a universe it never inhabited, a history that never happened, requires a vastly smaller entropy fluctuation than an entire ordered cosmos with billions of galaxies and trillions of stars, and at least one civilization asking questions about entropy. The probability of fluctuating a single brain with false memories out of thermal equilibrium is astronomically higher than the probability of fluctuating an entire observable universe. If the universe is eternal, and Boltzmann's fluctuation idea is correct, then the overwhelming majority of conscious observers should be these momentary, isolated, self-deluding blips in the void. They are called Boltzmann brains, and if you are one, you would never know it, because your memories, your experiences, your entire sense of having a past would be part of the fluctuation. We appear not to be Boltzmann brains. We have coherent histories. We observe consistent laws of physics. We can make predictions about the future based on those laws and have them confirmed by experiment. The universe around us makes sense in a way that a random fluctuation's fake memories almost certainly would not. Sean Carroll has argued that the Boltzmann brain scenario is what he calls cognitively unstable. It cannot simultaneously be true and justifiably believed. If you are a Boltzmann brain, you have no reason to trust any of your reasoning, including the reasoning that led you to conclude you are a Boltzmann brain. The hypothesis eats itself. There is something deeply strange about the Boltzmann brain problem, and it connects back to the past hypothesis in a way that closes a loop I opened earlier in this script. Remember, the arrow of time depends on the universe having started in an extraordinarily low entropy state. Penrose calculated the probability of that state at 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123. Physics cannot explain why that initial state was so improbable. It is simply assumed as the past hypothesis, and everything is built on top of it. The Boltzmann brain problem shows what happens when you try to avoid the past hypothesis. If you say the low entropy initial state was just a fluctuation, just a random dip in an otherwise equilibrium universe, then Boltzmann brains outnumber real observers. The theory refutes itself. If you say the low entropy initial state was not a fluctuation but a genuine boundary condition, a real property of the beginning of time, then you have to accept that the most important fact about the universe, the fact that gives time its direction and makes life and structure and change possible, is a fact without explanation. Either way, you end up in the same place. The arrow of time, the thing that makes your life possible, that makes cause precede effect, that makes memory work, that makes science work, rests on a foundation that physics cannot explain. The foundation is either an inexplicable boundary condition or a self-refuting fluctuation. Those are the options. The physics community does not talk about this much, and I think the reason is obvious. It is uncomfortable. It is the kind of foundational uncertainty that makes you want to change the subject and talk about something more tractable, like calculating cross-sections or fitting models to data. But the uncertainty is real, and it is sitting at the base of everything. Sean Carroll has spent years arguing that this is the most important unsolved problem in physics. Not the unification of gravity and quantum mechanics, not the nature of dark matter. The past hypothesis. Why did the universe begin in a state so improbable that its probability cannot be written using all the matter in the observable universe? That question, Carroll argues, is more fundamental than the question of what dark matter is, because the arrow of time, which depends on the past hypothesis, is what makes it possible to ask questions at all. Without the arrow of time, there is no cause and effect. Without cause and effect, there is no science. The thing we need to explain in order to do physics is the one thing physics cannot explain. And that is not fringe. That is not speculation. That is published, peer-reviewed cosmology, discussed at the highest levels of the field, and quietly absent from every popular science communication you have ever encountered. You were never told this, not because it was disproven, because the implication is too uncomfortable to say out loud in a format designed for a general audience. The implication is this: the arrow of time, the reason you experience reality as flowing from past to future rather than hovering in an eternal present, may be an accident, a contingent feature of the initial conditions. Change those conditions, and time could flow the other way, or not flow at all. Your experience of temporal flow, the feeling that the present is real and the past is gone and the future is coming, may not be a feature of reality. It may be a feature of the accident that reality happened to start from. But the Boltzmann brain problem is not merely a curiosity. It is now used as a serious criterion for evaluating cosmological theories. Any viable model of the universe must predict that we are typical observers, not random fluctuations. Any model that produces more Boltzmann brains than real observers is considered ruled out. The fate of the universe, the question of whether it reaches permanent equilibrium, is constrained by the requirement that the universe not be one in which most minds are hallucinating. And that requirement is harder to satisfy than you might think, because dark energy, the mysterious force driving the accelerating expansion of the universe, discovered in 1998, creates conditions that tend toward exactly the kind of eternal equilibrium that produces Boltzmann brains. The universe appears to be heading toward a de Sitter vacuum, a state of permanent, accelerating expansion with a fixed temperature, the Gibbons-Hawking temperature, of roughly 10 to the negative 30 K, warm enough, given infinite time, to produce fluctuations, including brain-shaped ones. In 1979, Freeman Dyson, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, published a paper in Reviews of Modern Physics called Time Without End: Physics and Biology in an Open Universe. It was an extraordinary act of intellectual defiance. Dyson argued that even in a universe winding down toward heat death, life could persist forever. by progressively slowing its metabolism, hibernating for longer and longer periods, thinking slower and slower thoughts. A sufficiently clever civilization could process an infinite number of thoughts using only a finite total energy reserve. It was a mathematical proof of eternal survival. It was also wrong, or rather, it was correct for the universe Dyson assumed, one expanding linearly and cooling without limit. The discovery of dark energy in 1998 from the observations of Type 1 supernovae by the Supernova Cosmology Project and the High-Z Supernova Search Team showed that the expansion is accelerating. The universe is not winding down gently, it is flying apart, ever faster. Lawrence Krauss and Glenn Starkman published a paper in 2000 showing that in a universe dominated by a positive cosmological constant, the total number of computational bits processable over all future time is finite, roughly 1.35 times 10 to the 120th bits. That is a large number, but it is finite, and a finite number of computations means a finite number of thoughts, a finite number of experiences, a finite amount of life. Dyson himself conceded. He wrote, "The time without end paper is obsolete because it assumed a linearly expanding universe." I want to sit with what Krauss and Starkman proved for a moment, because I think its full implications are easy to glide past. They showed that the total number of computational bits processable over all future time is finite, 1.35 times 10 to the 120th bits. That is the total cognitive budget of the universe. Every thought that will ever be thought by any mind in any civilization anywhere in the observable universe, from now until the last black hole evaporates and the last photon redshifts into oblivion, fits within that number. That means the total amount of experience that the universe will ever contain is bounded. There is a maximum number of songs that will ever be composed, a maximum number of theorems that will ever be proved, a maximum number of conversations that will ever be had, a maximum number of moments of joy, of grief, of wonder, of boredom. The universe is not a canvas of infinite possibility. It is a canvas of finite possibility, and most of it is already blank, and the rate at which those possibilities are being consumed is not constant. It is declining. In the Stelliferous era, where we live now, the universe is rich with energy gradients, dense with opportunities for complexity, buzzing with events. In the degenerate era, the rate of events drops by orders of magnitude per cosmological decade. In the black hole era, events become so rare that a single Hawking photon emitted by a stellar mass black hole represents a noteworthy occurrence. In the dark era, nothing happens. The cognitive budget is not just finite, it is front-loaded. The overwhelming majority of all possible experience is concentrated in the first infinitesimal fraction of the universe's lifespan. We are living in the richest moment, and it is already winding down. Freeman Dyson understood this, which is why his 1979 paper was not just a physics paper, but an existential one. He was not just asking whether life could persist, he was asking whether the universe has a future worth inhabiting. And the answer he found, the answer that said yes, that said an infinite amount of thought could be powered by finite energy. That said the universe could remain interesting forever. That answer was killed by a cosmological constant that was measured at roughly 6 times 10 to the negative 10th joules per cubic meter. A number so small it should not matter. But it does. It means the expansion accelerates. It means there is an event horizon. It means the accessible universe shrinks over time instead of growing. It means Dyson's infinite future compresses into a finite epilogue. Dyson was 95 when he died in February of 22. He never published a full response to the dark energy objection. In interviews, he expressed hope that the cosmological constant might not be truly constant, that it might decay over time, that some mechanism might yet open the door he had tried to walk through. But the data, as of the most recent measurements, supports a stable cosmological constant. The door, as far as the evidence is concerned, is closed, so there is no escape. Not for you, not for any civilization, no matter how advanced. Not for the universe itself. The second law runs the clock, and the clock has a final tick. I want to come back to Boltzmann now, because I promised earlier that the weight of the equation on the tombstone would become clear, and I think it is clear now. Boltzmann did not just discover a formula, he discovered the direction of reality. He found the single quantity, S, that connects the microscopic to the macroscopic, the reversible to the irreversible, the past to the future, life to death, existence to void. And he found it at a cost that the people who carved it on his tombstone will never fully understand, because they were the ones who inflicted it. S equals K log W, 5 symbols. The S tells you the entropy, the K tells you the scale, the log tells you to count configurations, the W tells you how many ways reality can hide beneath what you see, and the equation tells you that W almost always grows. It grows because the number of ways for things to fall apart is always, at every scale, in every system, incomprehensibly larger than the number of ways for things to hold together. That is why time flows forward, not because of some deep property of space-time, because there are more ways to be disordered than ordered, more ways to be dead than alive, more ways to be scattered than assembled. And the universe, which does not choose, which does not intend, which does not prefer, migrates toward the larger number simply because the larger number is larger. No force required, no intention needed, just counting. And that counting has consequences that do not stop at any scale. It explains why your coffee cools, why iron rusts, why mountains erode, why your proteins misfold, why your telomeres shorten, why you age, why you will die, why every person you have ever loved will die, why the sun will exhaust its fuel, why the stars will go dark, why the black holes will evaporate, why the last positronium atom will annihilate into photons that stretch until they carry no energy at all. The same equation, the same W, the same direction. I want to go back to something Bertrand Russell wrote in 1903 in an essay called A Free Man's Worship, published in the Independent Review. He wrote it before the Big Bang was known, before dark energy, before Hawking radiation, before anyone had calculated the timescales I just described to you. But he understood the emotional truth of the second law better than most physicists ever have. He wrote, "All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." Russell wrote that 123 years ago. Every cosmological discovery since then has confirmed it. The scaffolding is still standing. The despair is still the foundation. And the man who built the mathematical framework for understanding all of this, the man who translated the second law from a vague principle about heat engines into a precise, quantitative, universal statement about the structure of reality, the man who connected the microscopic to the macroscopic, the reversible to the irreversible, the living to the dying, that man hanged himself in a hotel room while his 15-year-old daughter swam in the bay below. I spent a long time thinking about whether Boltzmann understood the full implications of his own equation, whether he saw, as clearly as we can see now, that S equals K log W is not just a formula for the behavior of gases, but a sentence about the fate of everything. I think he did. I think the weight of knowing that the universe is being forced in one direction, that every structure is temporary, that the arrow of time points toward dissolution and cannot be turned around, combined with the cruelty of having his colleagues deny the reality of the atoms whose statistics he had spent his life elucidating, broke something in him that could not be repaired. There is a parallel here that I do not think is accidental. Boltzmann's body was a thermodynamic system. It maintained its structure through continuous energy expenditure. It repaired its DNA, folded its proteins, maintained its ion gradients, fired its neurons. And like all thermodynamic systems, it was subject to degradation. Not just physical degradation, psychological degradation, the accumulation of unrepaired damage, the erosion of the gradients that sustained hope and purpose, and the will to continue. The entropy of his internal state increased. The maintenance systems failed. The structure collapsed. And the equation he left behind, the one they carved into the marble after he was gone, describes exactly why that collapse was inevitable. Not just for him. For everything, there is a question that hovers over all of this, and I want to name it directly, even though I cannot answer it. If everything is temporary, if every structure is a fluctuation, if every mind is a brief eddy in the entropic current, does any of it matter? Does the fact that the universe will reach thermodynamic equilibrium in 10 to the 100th years mean that what happens between now and then is meaningless? I do not think so. But I want to be honest about why I do not think so, because the honesty matters more than the reassurance. The second law tells you the destination. It does not tell you the journey is worthless. Boltzmann's equation describes the statistical tendency of macroscopic systems. It does not contain a variable for meaning. It does not have a term for significance. Those are not thermodynamic quantities, and the second law has no opinion about them. But I also want to be honest about the other side. The second law does constrain what is possible. It does limit the duration of every structure, every mind, every civilization. It does guarantee that everything you build will be unmade. And there is no escape from that guarantee, not through technology, not through intelligence, not through any amount of cleverness. The second law has been tested more rigorously than any other principle in physics, and it has never failed, not once. So what you are left with is this. You exist in a universe that is moving toward a state where nothing exists. Your existence is temporary by the deepest law of physics. The law was discovered by a man who was destroyed for discovering it, vindicated after his death, and memorialized with an equation that describes the mechanism of his own dissolution. And the equation does not lie. It has never lied. It will not start lying for you. I do not know how to end this in a way that makes it okay. And I think the honest thing to do is not try, because the second law does not make it okay. The second law does not offer comfort. It does not promise renewal or resurrection or a second chance. It promises thermodynamic equilibrium. It promises that the number of hidden arrangements will grow until there are no more gradients to exploit, no more energy to dissipate, no more structures to maintain. It promises silence. The calculations have been checked. The second law holds. The entropy of the universe increases. The arrow of time points in one direction and cannot be reversed. Every structure you have ever known, every star that has ever burned, every thought that has ever been thought, is a temporary fluctuation in a system that is moving, with absolute statistical certainty, toward a state where none of it remains, not because something went wrong, not because of a flaw in the design, because the number of ways for things to fall apart is larger than the number of ways for things to hold together. And that ratio does not shrink, it does not stabilize, it does not plateau, it grows at every scale, in every system, for all of time. S equals K log W, the equation on the tombstone. 5 symbols that explain why time flows, why you age, why you will die, and why the universe will end. Written by a man the world rejected, carved into stone by the man who once opposed him, standing in a cemetery in Vienna where the groundskeepers trim the grass and the visitors take photographs, and the marble slowly, imperceptibly, grain by grain, dissolves into the rain. Even the tombstone is temporary. The marble that bears the equation will erode. The letters will become illegible. The bust will lose its features. The cemetery itself, the Zentralfriedhof with its avenues of chestnuts and its graves of emperors and composers, will one day be unrecognizable. Vienna will change. Austria will change. The continent will shift. The sun will exhaust its hydrogen in roughly 5 billion years and expand into a red giant, engulfing the inner planets and sterilizing the surface of the earth. The stone, the equation, the cemetery, the city, the civilization that built them, all of it will be erased by the same process the equation describes. But the equation itself will remain true, not carved in stone, not printed in textbooks, not stored in any physical medium that can survive the heat death, but true. S equals K log W will be true in the dark era. It will be true when the last black hole evaporates. It will be true when the universe is nothing but photons and neutrinos drifting through an emptiness so vast that the word vast becomes meaningless. The relationship between macrostates and microstates does not depend on anyone being alive to observe it. It does not depend on tombstones or textbooks or civilizations. It is a mathematical fact, and mathematical facts do not decay, which means that in a strange sense, the most permanent thing Ludwig Boltzmann ever created was not the equation carved on his grave. It was the equation itself. The stone will erode, the equation will not. The truth of S equals K log W will outlast the sun, the galaxy, the stars, the black holes, and the atoms. It will be true after the last structure in the universe has dissolved into equilibrium. It will be the last thing that is true, because it is the thing that explains why nothing else can last. The second law does not make exceptions, not for genius, not for love, not for civilizations, not for universes, and the W only grows.